The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Raven's Hollow Castle like a shroud, and Princess Charlotte pressed her face against the cold window glass of her tower room. Below, she could see the royal guards patrolling the courtyard in their crimson uniforms, their polished boots clicking against the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. At 17, Charlotte had spent most of her life watching the world from these same windows, but today felt different. Today, the familiar sight of the guards filled her with a desperate hope she had never felt before. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she traced patterns on the frosted glass. Her reflection stared back at her. Pale skin, dark circles under green eyes that once sparkled with mischief, and auburn hair that had grown long and unkempt during her months of confinement. The beautiful gowns that once filled her wardrobe had been replaced with simple gray dresses that hung loose on her increasingly thin frame. The princess who had once been the darling of the kingdom, beloved by all who knew her, had become a shadow of herself. The heavy wooden door to her chamber creaked open, and Charlotte quickly stepped away from the window. Her stepmother, Queen Vivian, glided into the room with her usual cold elegance. The woman's calculating blue eyes swept over Charlotte like ice, taking in every detail of her appearance with obvious displeasure. Queen Vivian was beautiful in the way that winter was beautiful, stunning but deadly, with platinum blonde hair always arranged in perfect coils, and skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. "Still gazing out at your precious guards? I see," Queen Vivian said, her voice carrying the subtle accent of the northern kingdoms where she had been born. "How pathetic. Do you truly believe any of them would risk their position to help you?" Charlotte straightened her shoulders, trying to summon the courage that had once made her father proud. "They swore an oath to protect the royal family. That includes me." Queen Vivian's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear stepdaughter, you are so naive. They serve the crown, and I wear that crown now. Your father's death changed everything, though you seem determined to live in the past." The mention of her father sent a sharp pain through Charlotte's chest. King Edmund had died 6 months ago in what everyone believed was a hunting accident, but Charlotte had her suspicions. Her father had been an experienced hunter, and the idea that he would simply fall from his horse and break his neck seemed impossible to her. But whenever she tried to voice these doubts, Queen Vivian would remind her that grief often made people see conspiracies where none existed. "I know what you're thinking," Queen Vivian continued, moving closer with predatory grace. "You still believe your father's death was something other than an accident. But even if it were, who would believe the word of a girl who has clearly lost her mind with grief?" Charlotte's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I haven't lost my mind. And I know you had something to do with father's death." The queen's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flashed in her eyes. "Such accusations could be considered treason, Charlotte. Lucky for you, I am a patient woman. But my patience has limits." Queen Vivian walked to Charlotte's writing desk and picked up the letter that lay there, another plea to her cousin Prince Marcus in the neighboring kingdom of Aldermere, begging him to come to her aid. The queen had allowed Charlotte to write these letters, knowing full well that they would never leave the castle. It amused her to watch Charlotte's hopes slowly die with each unanswered correspondence. "Still writing to Prince Marcus, I see. Tell me, dear, how many letters have you written now? 50? 100? And how many responses have you received?" Queen Vivian's smile was cruel as she tore the letter in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like dying butterflies. Charlotte wanted to scream, to rage against this woman who had systematically destroyed everything good in her life. But she had learned that showing emotion only fed Queen Vivian's cruelty. Instead, she kept her voice steady as she replied, "He will come for me. Marcus would never abandon family. Your precious cousin believes you are safely enjoying your education at the convent of St. Agatha. The letters I send him in your name are quite convincing. You write of your studies, your prayers, your contentment with the religious life. He has no idea that his beloved cousin is locked away in her own castle like some mad woman." The truth hit Charlotte like a physical blow. She had wondered why Marcus never responded to her letters, why no one from the outside world seemed to know of her plight. Queen Vivian had been intercepting everything, maintaining a careful facade that kept the outside world from knowing the truth. "You see, Charlotte, I have thought of everything. To the kingdom, you are safely away at your studies. To your cousin, you are content and happy. To the servants, you are recovering from the grief of losing your father. Only a select few know the truth, that you are here because you know too much about things that are none of your concern." Queen Vivian moved to the fireplace, where a small fire crackled weakly. She picked up the poker and stirred the flames, watching them dance higher. Your father was always too trusting. He believed the best in people, even when they were plotting against him. It was his greatest weakness, and, ultimately, it was his downfall. Charlotte felt her heart racing. This was the closest Queen Vivian had ever come to admitting her involvement in King Edmund's death. What did you do to him? The queen turned from the fire, her face a mask of false innocence. I did nothing but love him and try to guide him toward better decisions. Unfortunately, he was set in his ways. He refused to see that the old ways of ruling were no longer effective. The kingdom needed change, needed a stronger hand. But Edmund was too sentimental, too attached to outdated notions of honor and justice. Charlotte remembered her father's growing unease in the months before his death. He had confided in her that he suspected someone in his inner circle was plotting against him, selling information to enemy kingdoms. He had been investigating quietly, trying to identify the traitor without causing panic in the court. Now Charlotte realized that the traitor had been sleeping in his bed every night. The night before he died, Charlotte said slowly, "Father told me he had discovered something important about the grain shipments that had gone missing. He said he finally knew who was stealing from the royal treasury." Queen Vivian's composure slipped for just a moment, but it was enough. Charlotte saw the flash of fear in those cold blue eyes before the mask slipped back into place. Your father's imagination often ran away with him, especially toward the end. The stress of ruling was taking its toll. Perhaps it's better that he died when he did, before his reputation could be damaged by paranoid accusations. But Charlotte pressed on, emboldened by that moment of fear she had witnessed. He knew it was you, didn't he? He found proof that you were selling grain to our enemies while our own people went hungry. That's why you killed him. The slap came so quickly that Charlotte didn't see it coming. The force of Queen Vivian's hand across her face sent her stumbling backward, her cheek burning with pain. But even as tears sprang to her eyes, Charlotte felt a surge of satisfaction. She had finally gotten a real reaction from her stepmother. "How dare you?" Queen Vivian hissed, her perfect composure completely shattered. "How dare you accuse me of such things? I am the queen of this realm, and you are nothing but a spoiled child who refuses to accept that her father is dead and gone." Charlotte touched her stinging cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. But she met Queen Vivian's furious gaze without flinching. "I'm not a child anymore, and I won't stop fighting you, no matter how long you keep me locked up here." Queen Vivian took several deep breaths, visibly struggling to regain control of herself. When she spoke again, her voice was deadly quiet. "You want to fight me, Charlotte? Very well. But understand this. I hold all the power here. I control what you eat, what you wear, who you see, even whether you live or die. I have been patient with you out of respect for your father's memory, but that patience is at an end." The queen moved to the door, then paused to look back at Charlotte one more time. "Tomorrow, I am announcing your engagement to Lord Aldrich of Thornfield. You will marry him within the month, and then you will be his problem instead of mine. Lord Aldrich is a man who knows how to handle difficult women. I'm sure he will help you adjust your attitude." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. Lord Aldrich was known throughout the kingdom as a cruel and brutal man who had already buried 2 wives under mysterious circumstances. The thought of being handed over to him was more terrifying than anything Queen Vivian had done to her so far. "You can't," Charlotte whispered. "I won't marry him. You will marry him, or you will die. Those are your only choices now." Queen Vivian's smile was cold and final. "I suggest you use tonight to make your peace with your fate." With that, the queen swept out of the room, and Charlotte heard the heavy bar slide into place across the door. She was alone again, more trapped and desperate than ever before. She sank onto her narrow bed and buried her face in her hands, trying not to give in to the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. But as the hours passed and night fell over the castle, Charlotte found herself thinking about the guards she had watched from her window. Most of them were older men who had served her father faithfully for years. They knew her, had watched her grow up from a child into a young woman. Surely some of them must have questions about her sudden absence from court life, about the story that she had voluntarily gone away to study with the nuns. There was one guard in particular who had caught her attention in recent weeks. His name was Thomas, and he was younger than the others, probably only a few years older than Charlotte herself. She had noticed him because he often paused during his patrols to look up at her tower window, and she thought she had seen sympathy in his dark eyes. Unlike the other guards, who had been trained to look straight ahead and ignore everything else, Thomas seemed aware of the world around him. He seemed to see her as more than just a shadow behind glass. Charlotte rose from her bed and went back to the window. The courtyard below was lit by torches, and she could see Thomas making his rounds. On impulse, she pressed her palm against the glass and tapped softly with her knuckles. The sound was barely audible, but Thomas stopped and looked up. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Charlotte saw something that gave her hope, recognition, concern, and perhaps even determination. Thomas glanced around quickly to make sure no one was watching, then raised his hand briefly in acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but to Charlotte, it felt like a lifeline. Someone had seen her, had acknowledged her plight, and maybe, just maybe, was willing to help. As Thomas continued his patrol, Charlotte began to form a desperate plan. Tomorrow, Queen Vivian would announce her engagement to Lord Aldrich, and once that happened, her fate would be sealed. She had to escape before then, and Thomas might be her only chance. The guard clearly knew something was wrong with the official story about her absence, and he had shown her that he was aware of her situation. Now she needed to find a way to communicate with him, to convince him to help her. Charlotte looked around her room, searching for something she could use to write a message. Queen Vivian had taken away all her proper writing materials after tearing up her letter, but Charlotte found a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and a scrap of cloth from an old dress. Working by moonlight, she carefully wrote a plea for help, explaining her situation as briefly as possible. She told Thomas about Queen Vivian's plans to marry her to Lord Aldrich, about her suspicions regarding her father's death, and about her desperate need to escape the castle. When the message was complete, Charlotte tied the cloth to a small stone from the window ledge. She would have to wait for the right moment to drop it where Thomas could find it, but she was determined to try. It was risky. If the wrong person found the message, it could mean death for both her and Thomas. But she had no other choice. Tomorrow would bring her engagement announcement, and after that, her life would no longer be her own. Charlotte settled back by the window to wait for dawn, clutching the message in her hands like a talisman. Outside, Thomas continued his patrol, unaware that the princess watching from above had just made him her only hope for salvation. The night stretched on endlessly, filled with the weight of desperate plans and the fear of what morning would bring. But for the first time in months, Charlotte felt something other than despair. She felt the dangerous, fragile stirring of hope, and she held on to it with all her strength. The castle around them slept on, unaware that the seeds of rebellion were being planted in the dark hours before dawn. Queen Vivian lay in the royal chambers, confident that she had finally broken Charlotte's spirit and secured her own power. The guards walked their routes, most of them thinking only of duty and routine. But in the tower room high above, a princess plotted her escape, and in the courtyard below, a young guard looked up at her window and wondered what secrets the darkness held. Dawn would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities. The game between Charlotte and Queen Vivian was about to take a deadly turn, and Thomas, whether he knew it or not, was about to become a key player in a struggle that would determine the fate of the kingdom itself. The first light of dawn crept through Charlotte's window like an unwelcome messenger, bringing with it the reality of what this day would hold. She had not slept at all, spending the dark hours rehearsing her plan and watching for Thomas during his patrol rounds. The message cloth lay hidden in the folds of her dress, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Thomas appeared in the courtyard just as the castle began to stir with morning activity. Charlotte watched him carefully, noting how he moved with purpose rather than the mechanical routine of the other guards. There was an alertness about him that suggested intelligence and independent thinking, qualities that could either save her life or doom them both if he proved untrustworthy. Charlotte positioned herself at the window and waited for the perfect moment. Thomas was walking beneath her tower, and she could see that he was alone. Taking a deep breath, she dropped the weighted message, watching it fall through the morning air like a stone carrying all her hopes. It landed with a soft thud near Thomas's feet, and Charlotte held her breath as he stopped and looked down. Thomas glanced around quickly, then bent to pick up the cloth. Charlotte saw him unfold it and read her desperate words, his face growing grave as he absorbed the contents. When he finished reading, he looked up at her window, and Charlotte pressed her hand against the glass. Thomas nodded once, very slightly, then slipped the message inside his uniform and continued his patrol as if nothing had happened. Charlotte sank back against the wall, weak with relief and terror. She had done it. She had made contact with someone who might help her. But now the real danger began. If Thomas chose to report her message to Queen Vivian instead of helping her, Charlotte would face consequences far worse than marriage to Lord Aldrich. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Charlotte paced her room like a caged wolf, starting at every sound in the corridor outside. Servants brought her breakfast, thin porridge, and stale bread that she could barely force herself to eat. The food stuck in her throat as she imagined Queen Vivian preparing to announce her engagement to the court, sealing her fate forever. Around midday, Charlotte heard unusual activity in the castle corridors. Voices echoed off the stone walls, and she could hear the rustle of fine fabrics that suggested nobles were arriving for some formal occasion. Her heart sank as she realized Queen Vivian was gathering witnesses for the engagement announcement, making it impossible for Charlotte to later claim the arrangement was made under duress. The sound of footsteps on the tower stairs made Charlotte freeze. Someone was coming up to her room, and the heavy, measured tread suggested it was not a servant. Charlotte quickly composed herself, determined not to give Queen Vivian the satisfaction of seeing her fear. But when the door opened, it was not the queen who entered. Instead, Lord Aldrich himself stepped into the room, followed by two of his personal guards. Charlotte had seen Lord Aldrich at court functions before her confinement, but being alone with him in her small room made her skin crawl with revulsion and fear. Lord Aldrich was a tall man in his 40s, with graying hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to strip away her clothing with their gaze. His face bore the marks of a cruel nature, thin lips that rarely smiled except when others suffered, and a scar across his left cheek that he claimed came from battle but which Charlotte suspected had a more sinister origin. His wealth came from his vast estates in the harsh northern provinces, where rumors said his peasants lived in conditions little better than slavery. So, Lord Aldrich said, his voice carrying the rough accent of his homeland, "This is my intended bride." Queen Vivian spoke truly when she said you had grown into a beauty, Princess Charlotte. Charlotte backed toward the window, putting as much distance as possible between herself and this man who would soon control every aspect of her life. "I have not agreed to this marriage, Lord Aldrich. You cannot force me to wed you." Lord Aldrich's laugh was harsh and unpleasant. "Force you? My dear girl, I think you misunderstand your situation. You are a princess without a kingdom, a woman without protection, and a daughter without a father to defend her interests. Queen Vivian has graciously offered you to me as a bride, and I have accepted. Your agreement is neither required nor particularly relevant." He moved closer, and Charlotte caught the smell of wine and something else, something that reminded her of the stables, as if he did not bother to wash properly. "I know what you're thinking," he continued. "You've heard stories about my previous wives, about their unfortunate deaths. But those women failed to understand their place, failed to give me what I required of them. I trust you will prove more adaptable." Charlotte's voice shook despite her efforts to remain calm. "What happened to them?" Lord Aldrich's smile was genuinely terrifying. "My first wife, Lady Margaret, suffered from terrible nightmares. She would wake screaming about falling down the castle stairs, over and over again. Eventually, her nightmares became reality. My second wife, Lady Isabel, was convinced that someone was poisoning her food. Her paranoia grew so extreme that she stopped eating entirely. Very sad, really, watching someone waste away like that." The casual way he described these deaths, as if they were simply unfortunate coincidences rather than carefully planned murders, made Charlotte's blood run cold. This man was not just cruel. He was completely without conscience, a predator who had found a way to kill his wives legally and with the sympathy of society. "I can see that you're a sensible girl," Lord Aldrich continued, reaching out to touch Charlotte's cheek with fingers that felt like ice against her skin. "You understand that resistance would be both futile and dangerous. I'm sure we can have a very harmonious marriage, as long as you remember that a wife's duty is complete obedience to her husband." Charlotte jerked away from his touch, and Lord Aldrich's eyes flashed with anger. But before he could respond, there was a commotion in the courtyard below. Shouting voices and the sound of running feet drifted up through the window, and Lord Aldrich moved to look down at whatever was happening. "It seems there's some sort of disturbance," he said, frowning as he watched the scene below. "No matter. It will not interfere with our ceremony tomorrow morning. Queen Vivian has arranged for a priest to perform the rites immediately after the formal announcement. Tomorrow morning." Charlotte felt her knees go weak. She had known the marriage was coming soon, but She had hoped for more time to plan her escape. If Thomas was going to help her, it would have to be tonight. Lord Aldrich turned back to Charlotte, his expression softening into what he probably thought was reassurance, but which looked more like a predator studying its prey. I want you to know, my dear, that I bear you no ill will for your reluctance. It's natural for a young woman to feel nervous about marriage, especially to a man of my reputation. But I promise you that if you are a good wife to me, you will want for nothing. My estates are vast, my wealth considerable. You will have fine clothes, beautiful jewelry, servants to attend your every need. Charlotte found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. And if I'm not a good wife to you? Lord Aldrich's mask of false kindness slipped entirely. Then you will join Margaret and Isabel in the family crypt, and I will find myself a third wife who better understands the importance of wifely duty. With that cheerful threat hanging in the air, Lord Aldrich moved toward the door. I must return to the court now. Queen Vivian is hosting a feast tonight in honor of our engagement, and it would be rude to keep the other guests waiting. Rest well tonight, my dear. Tomorrow begins your new life as Lady Charlotte of Thornfield. As the door closed behind Lord Aldrich and his guards, Charlotte heard the bar slide back into place with a finality that made her stomach lurch. She was truly trapped now, with less than 24 hours before she would be handed over to a man who had already murdered 2 wives and would not hesitate to make her the third. Charlotte returned to her window, desperately hoping to see Thomas in the courtyard below. The disturbance Lord Aldrich had noticed seemed to have settled, but Charlotte could see unusual activity around the castle. Extra guards were posted at various points, and there seemed to be more people moving about than usual for an ordinary day. As evening approached, Charlotte could hear the sounds of the engagement feast beginning in the great hall below. Laughter and music drifted up through the castle walls, a mockery of celebration for what was essentially Charlotte's death sentence. She imagined Queen Vivian holding court, accepting congratulations on the excellent match she had arranged, while Lord Aldrich regaled the guests with tales of his wealth and power. The feast continued deep into the night, and Charlotte began to lose hope that Thomas would attempt to contact her. Perhaps he had thought better of getting involved, or perhaps Queen Vivian had somehow discovered their communication and taken steps to prevent any rescue attempt. Charlotte tried not to think about what might have happened to Thomas if he had been caught with her message. But just as Charlotte was beginning to despair completely, she heard something that made her heart leap. A soft scratching sound was coming from somewhere near her door, not the heavy footsteps of guards or servants, but something much more careful and deliberate. Charlotte pressed her ear to the wooden door and heard what sounded like someone working on the lock mechanism. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Charlotte heard the soft click of the lock opening. The bar on the outside was still in place, but someone was definitely trying to get into her room. Charlotte held her breath, torn between hope and terror. If it was Thomas, she was saved. If it was a trap set by Queen Vivian, she was as good as dead. The door opened just wide enough for someone to slip through, and Charlotte nearly cried out with relief when she saw Thomas's familiar face in the dim light from her small fireplace. The young guard quickly closed the door behind him and moved toward Charlotte, his expression grim with urgency. "Princess," he whispered, "we don't have much time. I've managed to distract the guards on this level, but they'll be back soon. Are you ready to leave this place?" Charlotte nodded eagerly, but Thomas held up a hand to stop her from speaking. "Before we do this, you need to understand what we're risking. If we're caught, Queen Vivian will have us both executed for treason. And even if we escape the castle, we'll be fugitives for the rest of our lives. Are you certain this is what you want?" Charlotte looked into Thomas's dark eyes and saw genuine concern for her welfare, not just blind obedience to royal blood. This man was willing to risk everything to help her, and she knew she would trust him with her life. "I'm certain," she whispered back. "I would rather die free than live as Lord Aldrich's prisoner." Thomas nodded grimly. "Then we go now. I've prepared a route that should get us out of the castle undetected, but it won't be easy. You'll need to do exactly as I say, and trust me completely." Charlotte gathered the few precious possessions she could carry, a locket that had belonged to her mother, a small purse containing the few coins she had managed to save, and her father's signet ring that she wore on a chain around her neck. Everything else that had once defined her life as a princess would have to be left behind. Thomas led her to the door and listened carefully for any sounds in the corridor. When he was satisfied that the way was clear, he motioned for Charlotte to follow him. They slipped out of the room and into the stone hallway, moving like shadows through the castle where Charlotte had once walked as its rightful heir. The escape route Thomas had planned took them through parts of the castle Charlotte had never seen before, narrow servant passages, forgotten stairways, and chambers that had been abandoned for years. Thomas moved with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time planning this route, and Charlotte realized he must have been preparing for this moment ever since he received her message. As they made their way through the labyrinthine passages, Thomas explained in whispered words what he had discovered about Queen Vivian's plans. The engagement to Lord Aldrich was just the beginning. Once Charlotte was married and safely out of the way, the Queen intended to stage a rebellion that would place her own infant son on the throne as the rightful heir, with herself as regent. Charlotte's father's death had been carefully planned to coincide with these larger schemes for power. Charlotte felt her blood boil as she learned the full extent of Queen Vivian's betrayal. Not only had the woman murdered her father and imprisoned her, but she was planning to steal the crown that rightfully belonged to Charlotte's bloodline. The thought of her father's kingdom falling into the hands of such a ruthless usurper gave Charlotte new strength to continue their dangerous escape. They had made it almost to the outer walls of the castle when disaster struck. As they crept through a narrow passage that led to the stables, they heard the sound of multiple footsteps approaching from behind. Someone had discovered Charlotte's escape, and the hunt had begun. Thomas grabbed Charlotte's hand and began to run, abandoning all pretense of stealth for speed. Behind them, they could hear Queen Vivian's voice echoing through the passages, screaming orders for their capture. The Queen's fury was terrifying even at a distance, and Charlotte could only imagine what punishments awaited them if they were caught. They burst out of the passage into the castle courtyard, where Thomas had horses waiting in the shadows near the stable. But, as they ran toward their escape, torches flared to life around them, and they found themselves surrounded by armed guards. Queen Vivian emerged from the castle entrance like an avenging fury, her face twisted with rage, and her elaborate gown billowing around her like dark wings. "Did you really think you could escape me so easily?" the Queen snarled, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Thomas, you have betrayed your oath and your queen. The penalty for such treason is death. As for you, my dear stepdaughter, you have just ensured that your wedding to Lord Aldrich will be far less pleasant than it might have been." Charlotte and Thomas stood back to back in the center of the circle of guards, their brief taste of freedom already slipping away. But Charlotte was surprised to find that she felt no regret for the attempt. For the first time in months, she had acted instead of simply enduring, had fought back instead of accepting her fate. Even if it ended in death, at least she would die as herself rather than as Lord Aldrich's victim. Thomas drew his sword, and Charlotte saw other guards hesitate. Despite his betrayal of Queen Vivian, Thomas was well-liked among the castle guard, and none of them seemed eager to be the first to attack him. This hesitation gave Charlotte an idea. If they could not escape through stealth, perhaps they could escape through chaos. "Guards of Raven's Hollow," Charlotte called out, her voice carrying the authority she had inherited from her father. "Look at what this woman has done to your kingdom. She murdered your rightful king and would steal the crown for her own purposes. Will you serve a usurper and a murderer, or will you remember your oath to the true royal bloodline?" Several of the guards exchanged uncertain glances, and Charlotte pressed her advantage. "Thomas risked his life to help me because he remembered his true duty. How many of you have questions about my father's death? How many of you have wondered why the princess disappeared so conveniently after the king died?" Queen Vivian's face went white with fury. "Silence her," she screamed. "She speaks lies and treason." But Charlotte's words had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of men who had served her father faithfully for years. The circle of guards began to waver, and Charlotte could see the uncertainty in their faces as they struggled between their duty to the current queen and their growing suspicions about the truth. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with everyone waiting to see who would make the first move. In that moment of perfect tension, Charlotte realized that her escape from the castle had become something much larger than a simple flight from an unwanted marriage. It had become the spark that might ignite a rebellion to reclaim her father's throne. The tension in the courtyard was so thick it seemed to press against Charlotte's chest like a physical weight. Guards shifted nervously, their loyalty clearly divided between their sworn duty to the crown and the growing suspicion that they had been serving a murderer and usurper. Queen Vivian's face had gone from white with fury to red with rage as she realized that her complete control over the situation was beginning to slip. "Captain Morrison," Queen Vivian shrieked at the grizzled leader of the castle guard. "I command you to arrest these traitors immediately." Captain Morrison was a man in his 60s who had served Charlotte's father since before Charlotte was born. His weathered face showed the internal struggle he was fighting as he looked between the queen who now wore the crown and the princess who carried the blood of kings. Charlotte could see in his eyes the moment when memories of her father's kindness and wisdom overcame his trained obedience to authority. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison said slowly, his voice carefully neutral, "perhaps it would be wise to hear what the princess has to say before we take any irreversible actions. These are serious accusations she has made, and they deserve to be addressed properly." Queen Vivian's eyes blazed with fury at this act of defiance from her own captain of guards. "You forget yourself, Morrison. I am your queen, and I will not be questioned by my own servants." But Charlotte could see that the captain's courage was spreading to other guards around the circle. Men who had served her father were beginning to remember their true loyalties, and the solidarity that had held Queen Vivian's forces together was starting to crack. Thomas, still standing with his sword drawn, spoke up for the first time since they had been surrounded. "Captain Morrison, I have served in this guard for 3 years, and in that time I have watched our queen systematically isolate and imprison the rightful heir to the throne. Princess Charlotte has been locked in that tower for months, and tomorrow she was to be married against her will to Lord Aldrich, a man known for murdering his wives." A murmur of unease rippled through the assembled guards. Many of them knew Lord Aldrich's reputation, and the idea of forcing their beloved princess into such a marriage clearly disturbed them. Charlotte seized on this moment of doubt to press her case further. "My father died under mysterious circumstances just 6 months ago," Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A man who had hunted these lands since boyhood, who could ride better than anyone in the kingdom, supposedly fell from his horse and broke his neck. But the night before he died, he told me he had discovered who was stealing grain from the royal stores and selling it to our enemies. He said he finally had proof of the traitor's identity." Several guards exchanged significant looks. Charlotte could see that rumors about the grain thefts had clearly circulated among the castle staff, even if they had been kept from the general population. Her father's investigation into the missing supplies had obviously been more widely known than Queen Vivian had realized. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Princess, are you saying that Queen Vivian was involved in your father's death?" Before Charlotte could answer, Queen Vivian let out a sound of pure rage and lunged toward her stepdaughter. But Thomas moved faster, intercepting the queen and knocking her backward with the flat of his blade. The action sent shockwaves through the assembled guards. No one had ever seen anyone lay hands on the queen before, and the sight of their ruler sprawled on the cobblestones was deeply shocking. "Enough!" Captain Morrison roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Every man here will lower his weapon and step back. We will settle this matter properly, without blood being shed in the courtyard of our own castle." Queen Vivian struggled to her feet, her elaborate hair coming loose from its careful arrangement, and her face twisted with hatred. "You will all pay for this treason. Lord Aldrich has soldiers stationed just outside the castle walls, and when he learns of this rebellion, he will crush every one of you." This revelation sent another ripple of alarm through the guards. The idea that foreign soldiers were so close to the castle without the knowledge or consent of the guard was deeply troubling. It suggested that Queen Vivian had been making military arrangements without consulting the traditional protectors of the realm. Charlotte felt a chill of fear as she realized the full scope of Queen Vivian's planning. The marriage to Lord Aldrich had not just been about getting rid of an inconvenient stepdaughter. It had been about bringing military force to bear against any resistance to her rule. Lord Aldrich's soldiers were probably intended to help Queen Vivian eliminate any nobles or guards who might question her authority or her infant son's claim to the throne. "How long have Lord Aldrich's men been camped outside our walls?" Captain Morrison demanded, his voice heavy with the authority of a man who had spent decades protecting the castle. Queen Vivian seemed to realize she had revealed too much, and her face grew cunning as she tried to regain control of the situation. "They are here as honored guests for the wedding ceremony. There is nothing unusual about a groom bringing his own guard to protect his interests." But Thomas shook his head grimly. "Captain, I've been watching those soldiers for the past week. They're not positioned like wedding guests. They're positioned like an army preparing for siege warfare. They have the castle completely surrounded, and they've been studying our defenses." The implications of this hit every guard in the courtyard like a physical blow. They had been unknowingly trapped in their own castle, surrounded by enemy forces while they went about their daily duties. Queen Vivian had essentially handed their stronghold over to a foreign lord without firing a shot. Captain Morrison's face darkened with anger and betrayal. "Your Majesty, you have brought foreign troops to surround the castle without consulting the guard or the nobles of the court. This is an act of treason against the realm itself." Queen Vivian laughed, but there was no humor in it, only cold calculation. "Treason? I am the queen. Everything I do is by definition legal and just. And you seem to forget that in a few hours, Lord Aldrich will be my daughter's husband and, therefore, a member of the royal family. His soldiers will become our soldiers." Charlotte stepped forward, drawing on every lesson in statecraft her father had ever taught her. "You seem to forget that I have not agreed to this marriage, and, under the laws of succession, you cannot give away my hand without my consent. I am the rightful heir to this throne, and I refuse to recognize your authority to make binding agreements with foreign powers." The legal challenge in Charlotte's words sent another wave of uncertainty through the assembled guards. Succession law was complex, but Charlotte was correct that as the legitimate heir, certain rights belonged to her that even a regent queen could not simply override. Queen Vivian's face showed that she knew her position was weaker than she had pretended. But before anyone could respond to Charlotte's challenge, the sound of horns echoed across the castle walls. Everyone in the courtyard froze as they recognized the signal. It meant that armed forces were approaching the castle. Queen Vivian's face lit up with malicious satisfaction as she realized that Lord Aldrich had apparently decided not to wait for dawn to claim his bride. "It seems my future son-in-law has grown impatient," Queen Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Captain Morrison, I suggest you order your men to open the gates and welcome our guests. Resistance would be unwise." Captain Morrison looked around at his guards, clearly torn between his duty to protect the castle and the reality that they were outnumbered and surrounded. Charlotte could see the despair growing in the faces of the men who had been ready to support her just moments before. The arrival of Lord Aldrich's forces had changed everything, turning what might have been a successful palace coup into a hopeless last stand. But Thomas had not given up. He moved closer to Charlotte and spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. "There's still a chance, Princess. I know these walls better than any of Lord Aldrich's men, and there are passages they haven't discovered. If we can create enough confusion, we might still be able to escape." Charlotte looked around at the guards who had been ready to support her cause, and she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of accepting Thomas's offer to run, she stepped forward and addressed Captain Morrison directly. "Captain, I know you're faced with an impossible choice, but I want you to think about what kind of kingdom we'll have if Queen Vivian succeeds in this plan. She has murdered my father, imprisoned the rightful heir, and invited foreign armies to occupy our lands. If you surrender now, every guard, every noble, every citizen who might oppose her will be eliminated. This is not about saving me anymore. It's about saving the kingdom itself." Captain Morrison's weathered face showed the weight of the decision before him. Around the courtyard, Charlotte could see other guards straightening their shoulders as they realized that she was right. This was not just about royal succession. It was about whether their homeland would remain free or become a puppet state controlled by Queen Vivian and Lord Aldrich. The horns sounded again, closer this time, and everyone could hear the sound of marching feet approaching the castle gates. In minutes, Lord Aldrich's soldiers would be demanding entry, and whatever decision they made would have to be made quickly. Charlotte felt a strange calm settle over her as she faced the most critical moment of her life. Everything that happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone in the kingdom who believed in justice and rightful rule. She thought of her father, who had always taught her that true nobility came not from blood or titles, but from the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. "Thomas," she said quietly, loud enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear, "I thank you for your courage in helping me escape. But I will not run from this fight anymore. If we're going to lose, we'll lose standing together. And if we're going to win, we need every loyal sword we can find." Thomas nodded grimly and moved to stand beside Charlotte, his sword still drawn but now pointed toward the castle gates where Lord Aldrich's forces would soon appear. One by one, other guards began to move, taking positions that showed their loyalty to the princess rather than the usurper queen. Captain Morrison looked around at his men, seeing the choice they were making, and Charlotte could see the moment when his own decision crystallized. He drew his sword and pointed it toward Queen Vivian, his voice carrying the authority of decades of service to the crown. Your Majesty, you are under arrest for treason against the realm and conspiracy to murder the rightful king. Surrender yourself to the custody of the castle guard, and you will be given a fair trial according to the laws of the kingdom. Queen Vivian's face contorted with rage and disbelief. She had been so close to complete victory, and now she watched it all crumbling around her. But as the sound of Lord Aldrich's approach grew louder, her expression shifted from fury to cold calculation. You fools, she said, her voice carrying a certainty that chilled everyone who heard it. You think you can stand against Lord Aldrich's army with a handful of castle guards? He has over 200 men, all of them hardened soldiers from the northern campaigns. You'll be slaughtered like sheep. Charlotte felt the fear that Queen Vivian's words inspired in the men around her, but she also felt something else, a determination that surprised her with its strength. She had spent months as a victim, accepting her fate and hoping for rescue. But now, faced with the final confrontation, she discovered that she was ready to fight for her birthright and her kingdom, regardless of the odds. The gates of the castle began to shake as Lord Aldrich's forces reached them and began demanding entry. Queen Vivian smiled coldly as the sound echoed through the courtyard, clearly confident that the arrival of her ally would end any resistance before it could truly begin. But Charlotte stepped forward and raised her voice so that every guard in the courtyard could hear her clearly. Men of Ravenshollow, you have served this castle faithfully for years, and now I ask you to serve it one more time. Not for my sake, but for the sake of every citizen who depends on us to protect them from tyrants and murderers. Whatever happens next, we will face it with honor, as befits the guardians of the realm. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Swords rang from their sheaths as the guards drew their weapons and formed a protective circle around Charlotte. Even knowing they were outnumbered and likely to die, these men had chosen to stand with their rightful princess against the forces that threatened everything they had sworn to protect. As the sound of Lord Aldrich's demands grew more insistent at the gates, Charlotte realized that her escape attempt had become something far more significant than she had ever imagined. It had become the beginning of a war for the very soul of the kingdom. The massive wooden gates of Ravenshollow Castle shuddered under the repeated hammering from Lord Aldrich's forces, each blow echoing through the courtyard like a war drum. Charlotte could hear voices shouting commands in the harsh accent of the northern provinces, and she knew that within minutes, the confrontation would begin in earnest. The Loyalist guards had taken defensive positions around the courtyard, but their faces showed the grim knowledge that they were vastly outnumbered. Captain Morrison moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent his lifetime preparing for moments like this. He quickly assigned guards to defensive positions, sent runners to alert the castle's servants to take shelter, and dispatched his most trusted men to secure the armory and ensure that Lord Aldrich's forces could not easily capture the castle's weapons stores. Queen Vivian stood in the center of the courtyard, no longer trying to maintain her royal composure. Her face was flushed with anger and anticipation as she watched the gates strain under the assault. You have perhaps 10 minutes before those gates give way, she called out to the assembled guards. Surrender now, and Lord Aldrich might show mercy. Continue this futile resistance, and he will show none of you quarter. Charlotte felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Thomas standing behind her, his expression serious but not despairing. Princess, there's something you need to know before the fighting begins. I haven't been entirely honest about who I am. Charlotte frowned, wondering what revelation could possibly matter at a time when they were all about to die fighting for the kingdom. What do you mean? Thomas glanced around to make sure Queen Vivian could not overhear, then spoke in a low, urgent voice. My real name is Thomas Blackwood. My father was Sir William Blackwood, who served as your father's chief advisor until his death 3 years ago. Charlotte's eyes widened with recognition. Sir William Blackwood had been one of her father's most trusted counselors, a man known for his wisdom and unwavering loyalty to the crown. She remembered attending his funeral and seeing the young man who had stood at the graveside. That had been Thomas. You're Sir William's son? But why are you serving as a common guard? Your father's lands and title should have passed to you. Thomas's expression darkened with old anger. Queen Vivian saw to it that my inheritance was confiscated shortly after my father's death. She claimed there were irregularities in his accounts, evidence of embezzlement that required the crown to seize his assets. I knew it was all fabricated, but I had no way to prove it. So I took a position in the castle guard under an assumed name, hoping to find evidence of her crimes. The revelation hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Queen Vivian had not just murdered her father and imprisoned her. She had been systematically eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to her plans. Sir William Blackwood's death, which everyone had assumed was from natural causes, now seemed much more suspicious. She killed your father too, didn't she? Charlotte said, the pieces falling into place in her mind. Thomas nodded grimly. I believe so, though I could never prove it. My father had been investigating the same grain thefts that concerned your father. The night before he died, he sent me a message saying he had discovered something important about the Queen's activities. He was found dead in his study the next morning, supposedly from a weak heart. The sound of splintering would drew their attention back to the gates, which were beginning to give way under the sustained assault. Captain Morrison shouted orders to his men, and Charlotte could see the grim determination in the faces of the guards who had chosen to stand with her. These men knew they were likely to die in the next hour, but they had made their choice based on principle rather than self-preservation. Queen Vivian laughed as she watched the gates weaken. How fitting that you should learn the truth about young Thomas just before you both die. Yes, I had his father eliminated, just as I had yours. They were both too curious for their own good, too willing to ask inconvenient questions about matters that were none of their concern. Charlotte felt rage building in her chest like a fire. The scope of Queen Vivian's betrayal seemed to grow with each revelation. This woman had murdered not just one king, but multiple members of the nobility, all in pursuit of power that rightfully belonged to others. How many people have you killed to secure your position? Charlotte demanded, her voice carrying across the courtyard clearly enough for all the guards to hear. Queen Vivian's smile was cold and satisfied. Enough. Your father was not the first obstacle to my plans, and if you had been more cooperative, he would not have been the last. But people in power must sometimes make difficult decisions for the greater good. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face showing disgust at Queen Vivian's casual admission of multiple murders. Your Majesty, you are confessing to crimes against the realm and against the nobles who served faithfully under King Edmund. These are not difficult decisions. These are the actions of a tyrant who values power over justice. The gates finally gave way with a tremendous crash, and Lord Aldrich's soldiers poured through the opening like water through a broken dam. Charlotte got her first good look at the force that had come to claim her, and her heart sank at the sight. These were not the ceremonial guards she was accustomed to seeing at court functions. These were hardened warriors, men whose scarred faces and battle-worn equipment spoke of years spent in actual combat. Lord Aldrich himself rode through the gates on a massive black warhorse, his armor polished to a mirror shine that reflected the torchlight like dark water. He surveyed the scene in the courtyard with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey, and when his eyes settled on Charlotte, his smile made her skin crawl with revulsion. Princess Charlotte, Lord Aldrich called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. How delightful to see you again so soon. I confess I'm somewhat disappointed to find you in the company of traitors and rebels, but I'm sure we can correct this unfortunate misunderstanding. Charlotte stepped forward, drawing on every lesson and courage her father had ever taught her. Lord Aldrich, you have brought armed forces onto the grounds of Raven's Hollow Castle without permission from the rightful authorities. I demand that you withdraw your soldiers immediately. Lord Aldrich's laughter was genuinely amused. Rightful authorities? My dear child, Queen Vivian invited me here to collect my bride, and she is the only authority that matters in this kingdom. As for my soldiers, they are here to ensure that our wedding proceeds without interference from malcontents and troublemakers. Captain Morrison stepped protectively in front of Charlotte, his sword drawn and ready. Lord Aldrich, Princess Charlotte has not consented to this marriage, and under the laws of succession, her consent is required. Any attempt to force this union would be illegal. Lord Aldrich dismounted from his horse with casual grace, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Captain Morrison, isn't it? I remember you from my previous visits to court. You always struck me as an honorable man, which makes your current position all the more unfortunate. Honor, you see, is a luxury that can only be afforded by those with the power to enforce their principles. The courtyard had become a tableau of opposing forces, Charlotte and her loyal guards on one side, Queen Vivian and Lord Aldrich with his soldiers on the other. The numerical disparity was overwhelming. Charlotte counted at least 40 of Lord Aldrich's men in the courtyard, with more still streaming through the broken gates. Her supporters numbered perhaps 20 at most. But, as Charlotte looked around at the faces of the men who had chosen to stand with her, she saw something that gave her hope despite the odds. These were not men who had been coerced or bribed into loyalty. They were men who had served her father faithfully and who believed in the principles he had taught them. They might be outnumbered, but they were fighting for something more valuable than their own lives. Thomas moved to Charlotte's side, his sword drawn but not yet raised in aggression. "Lord Aldrich, you claim to be here for a wedding, but you've surrounded the castle like an invading army. What kind of groom brings 200 soldiers to claim his bride?" Lord Aldrich's expression grew cold at Thomas's challenge. "The kind of groom who understands that some brides require persuasion to see the wisdom of their situations. Princess Charlotte has clearly been influenced by rebellious elements who have filled her head with foolish notions about choice and consent. Once she is safely away from these troublemakers, I'm sure she will come to appreciate the advantages of our union." Queen Vivian stepped forward, clearly eager to see the confrontation resolved in her favor. "Lord Aldrich, I suggest we dispense with these negotiations. Princess Charlotte will marry you as agreed, and these rebels will submit to your authority or face the consequences." But Charlotte found her voice again, and when she spoke, it carried the authority that came from royal blood and righteous anger. "I will never marry you, Lord Aldrich. Not willingly, not under duress, not if you hold a sword to my throat. I am the rightful heir to this throne, and I will not be handed over to a murderer and his co-conspirator." Lord Aldrich's face darkened with anger at Charlotte's defiance. "Murderer? That's a serious accusation, Princess. I hope you can substantiate such claims." Charlotte felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything that happened next would depend on her ability to turn the castle guards, and perhaps even some of Lord Aldrich's men, against the conspiracy that threatened the kingdom. She took a deep breath and spoke clearly enough for everyone present to hear. "You murdered your first 2 wives, just as Queen Vivian murdered my father and Thomas's father. You are both killers who use your positions of power to eliminate anyone who stands in your way. If I marry you, I will be dead within a year, and Queen Vivian will have a clear path to place her infant son on the throne with herself as regent." A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers as they processed Charlotte's accusations. Even among Lord Aldrich's hardened troops, there seemed to be some unease at the idea of participating in what amounted to a kidnapping and forced marriage. These were warriors, not murderers, and Charlotte could see that some of them were beginning to question what they had been ordered to do. Lord Aldrich's face flushed with rage at having his crimes spoken aloud in front of his own men. "You dare to slander my name with these wild accusations? I have been patient with your hysterics, but my patience has limits." He drew his sword with a sound like thunder, and immediately the tension in the courtyard ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level. Charlotte's guards raised their weapons defensively, while Lord Aldrich's soldiers moved into attack positions. The moment of decision had arrived, and Charlotte realized that whatever happened next would determine the fate of everyone present. But before the first blow could be struck, a new sound echoed across the castle walls, the sound of war horns, but not the rough northern instruments that had announced Lord Aldrich's arrival. These were the clear, bright notes of the royal guard's own horns, and they were coming from outside the castle walls. Everyone in the courtyard froze as they tried to understand what this new development meant. Charlotte felt her heart leap with hope, but she tried not to let it show on her face. Could it be that help was arriving, or was this simply another force allied with Queen Vivian and Lord Aldrich? The answer came moments later when a voice called out from beyond the broken gates, a voice that Charlotte recognized with overwhelming relief and joy. "Princess Charlotte, cousin, we have come to answer your call for aid." Prince Marcus of Aldermere had arrived with his own forces, and Charlotte realized that somehow, despite Queen Vivian's interference with her letters, word of her plight had reached the outside world. The rebellion that had begun as a desperate escape attempt was about to become a full-scale war for the crown of Raven's Hollow. The sound of Prince Marcus's voice calling across the castle walls sent a shock of hope through Charlotte's body, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. For months, she had believed herself completely alone, abandoned by everyone who had once claimed to care about her. But now her cousin had arrived with his own forces, turning what had seemed like a hopeless last stand into a battle that might actually be won. Lord Aldrich's face had gone pale with rage and calculation as he realized that his carefully planned conquest was about to become a genuine war. He had expected to face only a handful of castle guards, not the organized military force that Prince Marcus represented. Queen Vivian, meanwhile, looked like she was seeing her meticulously constructed plans crumbling before her eyes. How did he know to come here? Queen Vivian hissed, her composure finally cracking completely. I sent regular letters to Prince Marcus assuring him that Charlotte was safe and content at the convent. There was no way he could have learned of her situation. Thomas stepped forward, a grim smile on his scarred face. That's where you made your mistake, Your Majesty. You assumed that Princess Charlotte was your only source of information to the outside world. But you forgot about the merchants, the traveling priests, the servants who have family in other kingdoms. Word of the princess's disappearance has been spreading for weeks among people who knew to look for signs that all was not well. Charlotte felt a surge of pride in Thomas's foresight and planning. While she had been focused on her desperate escape attempt, he had apparently been working on a much larger strategy to expose Queen Vivian's crimes and bring help from outside the kingdom. The young guard had proven himself to be not just brave, but genuinely clever in ways that might save them all. Prince Marcus's voice called out again, closer now as his forces approached the castle entrance. Lord Aldrich, I know you and your soldiers are within these walls. I have come under the ancient laws of kinship to investigate reports that my cousin Princess Charlotte is being held against her will. Withdraw your forces and submit to negotiation or face the consequences of your actions. Lord Aldrich snarled with frustration as he realized he was caught between opposing forces. His soldiers, who had expected an easy victory against a few castle guards, now found themselves potentially trapped within the castle walls with enemy forces approaching from outside. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically in a matter of moments. Lord Aldrich, Captain Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military experience. You have the choice to end this without bloodshed. Princess Charlotte has family and allies who will not allow her to be taken by force. Surrender yourself and Queen Vivian to Prince Marcus's custody, and your soldiers will be allowed to depart unharmed. But Lord Aldrich was not a man accustomed to surrender, especially when he had come so close to achieving his goals. His face twisted with determination and rage as he raised his sword above his head, preparing to signal his men to attack despite the changed circumstances. I have not come this far to be thwarted by a princess's cousin and a handful of loyal guards. Lord Aldrich shouted. Queen Vivian has promised me Charlotte's hand and a substantial dowry, and I intend to collect what is owed to me. The admission that this had all been about money as much as power sent another wave of disgust through the assembled guards. Even some of Lord Aldrich's own soldiers seemed disturbed by their lord's casual admission that he was essentially trying to purchase a princess like a piece of property. Charlotte stepped forward, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been locked in the tower room. The events of this night had forged her into something stronger, someone worthy of the crown her father had intended her to inherit. Lord Aldrich, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. You speak of what is owed to you, but you have earned nothing except the hatred of everyone who values justice and decency. You are a murderer who kills women for sport, and you will never have any claim on me or my kingdom. Lord Aldrich's response was to charge directly at Charlotte, his sword raised to strike her down where she stood. But Thomas was faster, intercepting the attack with his own blade and engaging Lord Aldrich in single combat. The ring of steel on steel echoed through the courtyard as the two men fought, and Charlotte realized that this duel would likely determine the outcome of everything that followed. Around them, the larger battle erupted as Lord Aldrich's soldiers clashed with Charlotte's guards. The sound was deafening, shouting voices, clanging weapons, the screams of wounded men. Charlotte found herself pressed back against the castle wall, protected by a small group of guards who formed a defensive circle around her. Prince Marcus's forces had reached the castle gates and were pouring through to join the battle. Charlotte caught glimpses of her cousin through the chaos, tall, fair-haired, and magnificent in his silver armor as he cut his way through the melee toward where she stood. Prince Marcus had always been everything a prince should be, brave, honorable, and utterly devoted to protecting those he loved. The tide of battle began to turn as Prince Marcus's fresh troops engaged Lord Aldrich's soldiers, who had not expected to fight a pitched battle within the confines of the castle courtyard. But the fighting was fierce and bloody, and Charlotte watched in horror as men she had known since childhood fell wounded or dead in the struggle for her freedom. Queen Vivian, seeing that her carefully laid plans were collapsing around her, made one final desperate attempt to salvage victory from defeat. She pulled a long dagger from the folds of her gown and began moving through the battle toward Charlotte, clearly intending to eliminate the princess rather than see her regain her rightful throne. But Captain Morrison had been watching the queen carefully, and he intercepted her before she could reach Charlotte. The grizzled captain and the murderous queen fought with the desperation of people who knew that only one of them would survive this night. Queen Vivian was surprisingly skilled with her dagger, but Captain Morrison had the advantage of experience and righteous anger. Meanwhile, Thomas and Lord Aldrich continued their duel in the center of the courtyard, both men bleeding from several wounds, but neither giving ground. Lord Aldrich was the larger and stronger fighter, but Thomas had youth and agility on his side, along with the motivation of a man fighting for justice rather than greed. Charlotte watched the dual combats with her heart in her throat, knowing that the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. If Thomas fell to Lord Aldrich, or if Captain Morrison was defeated by Queen Vivian, all their sacrifices would be for nothing. Even Prince Marcus's arrival might not be enough to save them if the key leaders of the resistance were eliminated. But Thomas had been holding back some of his skill, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Lord Aldrich pressed forward with a particularly vicious attack, Thomas sidestepped and brought his sword around in a perfect arc that caught Lord Aldrich in the side, driving deep between his ribs. Lord Aldrich gasped and staggered, his sword dropping from nerveless fingers as he fell to his knees. "This is for your wives," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying in a moment of relative quiet. "And for all the other innocent people you've murdered in your pursuit of wealth and power." Lord Aldrich tried to speak, perhaps to beg for mercy or to curse his enemies, but blood filled his mouth, and he collapsed forward onto the cobblestones, dead. The sight of their lord's defeat sent a wave of demoralization through his soldiers, many of whom began to throw down their weapons and surrender. Captain Morrison's fight with Queen Vivian ended moments later when the captain's superior strength and experience finally overcame her desperate cunning. Queen Vivian fell with the captain's sword through her heart, her face showing surprise even in death that her schemes had finally come to an end. With their leaders dead and surrounded by hostile forces, the remainder of Lord Aldrich's soldiers quickly surrendered. Prince Marcus strode through the now quiet courtyard to where Charlotte stood, and she ran to embrace her cousin with tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. "Charlotte," Prince Marcus said, holding her tightly, "when Thomas's messages finally reached me, I could hardly believe what I was reading. But I see now that even his worst fears were less terrible than the reality of what you've endured." Charlotte pulled back to look at her cousin in confusion. "Thomas's messages? But how did he manage to get word to you when Queen Vivian was intercepting all my letters?" Prince Marcus smiled and gestured for Thomas to join them. The young guard approached, limping slightly from a wound to his leg, but otherwise intact. "Thomas has been far more resourceful than any of us realized. When he recognized that you were truly in danger, he began sending coded messages to my court through merchant networks and traveling priests. It took weeks for me to understand what he was trying to tell me, but eventually the picture became clear." Thomas nodded, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a terrible burden for months. "I knew that direct communication would be intercepted, so I had to find other ways to get information out of the castle. A word to a merchant here, a message to a priest there, always in code so that if Queen Vivian's agents caught them, they would seem like innocent conversations." Charlotte felt a wave of gratitude toward Thomas that was almost overwhelming. While she had been locked in her tower feeling abandoned and hopeless, he had been working tirelessly to bring help to her. His loyalty and cleverness had literally saved her life and the kingdom itself. Prince Marcus looked around at the aftermath of the battle, his expression grave as he surveyed the cost of Queen Vivian's treachery. "Charlotte, the question now is what happens next. Queen Vivian is dead, but she leaves behind an infant son who technically has a claim to the throne. The kingdom will need strong leadership to recover from this chaos." Charlotte straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on them like a mantle. "The infant prince is innocent of his mother's crimes, but he cannot rule. I am my father's heir, and I will take my rightful place as Queen of Raven's Hollow. But first, we must ensure that justice is done for all who suffered under Queen Vivian's tyranny." Captain Morrison, wounded but still standing, stepped forward and knelt before Charlotte. Charlotte looked around at the faces surrounding her, some wounded, all exhausted, but united in their determination to rebuild what Queen Vivian had tried to destroy. She thought of her father, who had always taught her that true leadership meant serving others rather than being served by them. "Rise, all of you," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to command through suffering and sacrifice. "We have won a great victory tonight, but our real work is just beginning. We must heal the wounds that treachery has inflicted on our kingdom, and we must ensure that the people of Raven's Hollow never again suffer under the rule of tyrants and murderers." Thomas stepped forward, his expression serious but hopeful. "Your Majesty, what are your orders?" Charlotte smiled at the young man who had risked everything to save her, knowing that she would rely heavily on his counsel in the difficult days ahead. "First, we care for our wounded and honor our dead. Then, we begin the work of rebuilding trust and justice in Raven's Hollow. And, Thomas, I want you to accept your rightful place as Sir Thomas Blackwood, heir to your father's lands and titles. The crown owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." As the sun began to rise over the castle walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Charlotte felt a sense of peace she had not known since her father's death. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges that would test her wisdom and courage. But she was no longer alone, no longer the frightened girl locked in a tower room. She was Queen Charlotte of Raven's Hollow, and she would rule with the strength, justice, and compassion her father had taught her. The kingdom had been wounded, but it would heal. The crown had been threatened, but it had been preserved. And, most importantly, the forces of tyranny and murder had been defeated by the courage of ordinary people who chose to do what was right rather than what was safe. The nightmare was over, and a new chapter in the history of Raven's Hollow was about to begin.